The small wooden door, barely visible against the snow-drifted hillside, creaked open, spilling a rectangle of impossible golden light onto the frozen ground. For the 27 souls huddled in the biting January air of 1888, it was a sight that defied all logic. They had come expecting to find a grave, a mound of ice marking the final resting place of the boy they had cast out. Instead, they found him alive. 12-year-old Jonas Elijah Whitmore stood in the doorway, framed by the warmth of a steady fire, the scent of smoked meat and pine smoke clinging to him like a second skin. He was not the starved, frozen corpse they had imagined, but a silent, steady presence. His eyes met those of Jedediah Crawford, the very man who had branded him a liar and exiled him, and in that gaze there was no triumph, no anger, only a profound and unsettling stillness that seemed to magnify the howling of the wind and the depth of their own shame. This is a story about a warning that was ignored and a debt that could never be repaid, a testament to a quiet form of strength that blossoms in the harshest of winters. If you believe that a single act of foresight can change the world, let us know in the comments where you are listening from today. Your presence in our community is what allows these narratives to be heard, so please consider liking this story and subscribing to the channel to ensure you don't miss the journey that brought this boy to this very moment. It's a journey worth hearing until the very end, a reminder that sometimes the greatest wisdom is found in the places we are taught to dismiss. But to understand how a boy, banished for speaking a difficult truth, became the unlikely savior of the very people who condemned him, we must go back. We must travel 3 months into the past, to the crisp golden autumn of 1887. It was a time before the house-burying snow, a time when the world was still full of color, and the lessons of a lost father were the only inheritance Jonas Whitmore had left. It was then, in the rustle of falling leaves and the early migration of the geese, that the first signs of the coming catastrophe appeared, visible only to a boy who had been taught how to see. 12-year-old Jonas Elijah Whitmore existed in the spaces between things. He was a resident of Elm Creek but had no home, a worker in the harvest with no claim to its bounty, a boy among people who saw him as something other. In the autumn of 1887, his world had shrunk to the size of a barn loft, the scent of hay and dust his only constant companions. It had been less than a year since he'd watched his father, Samuel, draw his last ragged breath, taken by a fever that had swept through his lungs like a prairie fire. Now Jonas was a ward of the town council, a responsibility they bore with a visible and weary tolerance. Each night he would lie on a bed of straw, a threadbare blanket pulled to his chin, and listen to the sounds of a family he wasn't part of, settling down for the night on the other side of the wall. The murmur of their voices was a language from a world he no longer inhabited. His days were a repeating cycle of labor, a blur of sunrises and sunsets, measured in aching muscles and calloused hands. He was passed from one farm to the next, a silent, efficient tool for mending fences, clearing stones, or bringing in the corn. He learned to anticipate the needs of the families he served, the Holcombs, the Millers, the Davidsons. But he was never truly seen by them. He was simply the boy, a shadow who appeared at dawn and vanished at dusk. He ate his meals on the porch steps, a plate of whatever was left over passed through a cracked open door. He watched the other children play from a distance, their laughter a bright, sharp sound that seemed to highlight his own profound silence. He learned that belonging was a warmth he could remember, but could no longer feel, like the phantom heat from a long-extinguished fire. The people of Elm Creek were sturdy and devout, their lives governed by the predictable turn of the seasons and the unwavering authority of the printed word. They placed their faith in almanacs and sermons, in things that could be held and read. Jonas, with his quiet ways and his habit of watching the sky, was an unsettling presence. He was Samuel Whitmore's son, the child of a white trapper and his half-Cheyenne wife, and that heritage clung to him like a foreign scent. His knowledge, inherited from a father who read the land instead of books, was dismissed as folklore, the superstitious ramblings of an uneducated mind. When he spoke of the way the spiders were weaving their webs or the unusual depth of the squirrels' nests, the farmers would just nod politely and send him back to his chores, their skepticism a wall he could not breach. This wall of disbelief was built and maintained by one man more than any other, Jedediah Crawford. As the head of the town council, Crawford's voice was law in Elm Creek. He was a man whose certainty was as hard and unyielding as the frozen winter ground, a man who saw the world in columns of figures and biblical verses. He held a particular disdain for the knowledge Jonas represented, viewing it as a primitive and dangerous distraction from the practical work of building a community. Crawford's gaze would often fall on Jonas during town gatherings, a look of cold assessment that made the boy feel like a weed in a well-tended garden. Jonas learned to make himself smaller in Crawford's presence, to lower his eyes and quiet his breathing, knowing that he was a living contradiction to everything the man believed to be true and orderly. In the solitude of the fields, Jonas found solace in his father's memory. He would close his eyes and hear Samuel's voice, low and patient, explaining how the angle of the sun revealed the coming frost, or how the flight patterns of the geese told a story of the winds to the north. These lessons were his only inheritance, a legacy of observation and respect for a world the people of Elm Creek saw only as a resource to be tamed. His father had taught him that everything in nature was connected, a vast and intricate language spoken in the rustle of leaves and the behavior of animals. For Jonas, studying these signs was more than a skill. It was an act of love, a way of keeping his father's spirit alive within him. It was a private world of meaning that insulated him from the cold indifference of his new life. The physical reality of his existence was a constant dull ache. The autumn air grew colder each week, and the chill seemed to find every gap in his worn wool coat. He was always hungry, not starving, but carrying a persistent emptiness that no single meal could ever truly fill. He learned to move with a deliberate economy of motion, conserving warmth and energy for the long hours of work. At night in the barn, he would curl into a tight ball, the scratch of the straw against his cheek a familiar discomfort. He dreamed not of feasts or a warm bed, but of simple things, a pair of boots without holes, a moment of stillness without a task waiting, a single person looking at him and seeing not a burden but just a boy. By mid-October, his observations began to coalesce into a growing sense of unease. It wasn't one thing, but 100 small, interlocking details. The coyotes on the ridge had grown fur so thick they looked bloated, their coats a deep, heavy grey he had never seen before. The rabbits, too, were heavier, their movements less frantic and more deliberate, as if they were already preparing for a long siege. He watched the beavers on the creek reinforcing their dams with an almost desperate intensity, using mud and branches to build the walls higher and thicker than in any previous year. The farmers he worked for noticed none of it, their eyes fixed on the harvest, on the tangible wealth being brought in from the fields. They were blind to the subtle warnings whispered all around them. He kept his thoughts to himself, knowing they would be unwelcome. His isolation became a forge, hardening his resolve. He had no one to share his fears with, no one to ask for guidance except the voice in his memory. He would walk the edges of the fields at dusk, his gaze sweeping across the landscape, cataloguing the changes. The birdsong was different, thinner and more urgent. The air itself felt heavier, carrying a strange metallic scent on the wind. He felt a profound loneliness, the weight of a truth that only he could see. He was a sentinel on a wall no one else knew existed, watching for an enemy no one else believed was coming. In his pocket, his fingers would often close around a small, smooth river stone, worn dark and grey from years of handling. His father had given it to him on his 7th birthday, telling him it was a piece of the earth's heart, a reminder that he was never truly alone. When the stares of the townsfolk grew too heavy, or when Jedediah Crawford's voice cut through the air with its cold authority, Jonas would press his thumb into the stone's cool surface. It was a small, secret anchor in a world that threatened to cast him adrift. The stone didn't offer answers, but it offered connection, a tangible link to a time when he was loved, a time when his way of seeing the world was not a curse, but a gift. As October drew to a close, a new sign appeared, one that solidified his fear into certainty. One night, looking up at the sky, he saw it, a faint, milky ring around the moon. His father had shown him this phenomenon years ago, explaining that the color and size of the halo were a message. This one was pale and wide, with a strange, almost greasy shimmer. He remembered his father's exact words, spoken in a hushed tone around a campfire long ago. That color, that specific luminescence, meant a winter of house-burying snow. It was not just a forecast of a hard season. It was a prophecy of a cataclysm, a force of nature that could erase a town from the map. The knowledge settled in his chest like a block of ice. He was no longer just an observer. He was a witness. The bountiful harvest the town celebrated felt like a cruel irony, a final generous offering before a great and terrible reckoning. He looked at the sturdy homes of Elm Creek, at the smoke curling from their chimneys, and saw them as fragile, temporary shelters. He watched the families walking home from church, their faces full of contentment and faith in their orderly world, and felt a chasm open between him and them. He knew he could not remain silent. The memory of his father demanded more. He had to speak, even if it meant facing the full force of their scorn. The decision was made not out of a desire for acceptance, but out of a duty to the truth his father had taught him to see. The time for silent observation was over. Jonas knew this with a certainty that chilled him more than the late October wind. The signs were no longer whispers. They were a collective shout, a chorus of warnings from the natural world that the people of Elm Creek were determined to ignore. He felt the weight of his father's lessons not as a comfort, but as a profound and heavy responsibility. To see such a clear truth and say nothing felt like a betrayal of Samuel's memory, a betrayal of the very essence of who he was. He spent a full day turning the decision over in his mind, the smooth river stone a constant presence in his palm. He knew what would happen. He knew they would not listen. But the image of the moon's pale, greasy halo was burned into his thoughts, and he understood that he had to try. He would not be speaking to them as a boy seeking a place at their fire, but as a witness delivering a testimony he could no longer hold inside. He requested a moment with the town council, a request so unusual it was granted out of sheer curiosity. The meeting was held in the small, stuffy room behind the general store, a space that smelled of old paper, pipe smoke, and the unyielding certainty of the men who gathered there. Jonas stood before them, a small, solitary figure in worn clothes, his hands clasped behind his back to keep them from trembling. The council members sat around a heavy oak table, their faces etched with the fatigue of the long harvest season. At the head of the table sat Jedediah Crawford, his posture rigid, his eyes holding a familiar look of cold assessment. The air was thick with unspoken judgment, a wall of skepticism that Jonas would have to breach with nothing but the truth his father had taught him. He took a slow breath, the silence in the room pressing in on him from all sides. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, but did not waver. He did not plead or embellish. He simply presented the facts as he had observed them, a methodical and unadorned list of nature's quiet preparations for a coming war. He spoke of the wasp nests, built not under the eaves of the barns as they usually were, but high in the forks of the tallest oak trees, a sign of deep snow to come. He described the coyotes he had seen on the ridge, their fur so unnaturally thick and matted that it changed the very shape of their bodies. He told them of the rabbits, heavy and slow, and of the beavers on the creek whose dams were now nearly 6 feet high, reinforced with a frantic diligence that spoke of a deep, instinctual fear. He laid out his evidence piece by piece, hoping the sheer volume of it would force them to see the pattern. He saved the most crucial sign for last, the one that had solidified his own fear into a cold, hard certainty. He looked directly at the council, his gaze sweeping over their impassive faces before finally landing on Jedediah Crawford. He described the night sky from a week prior, detailing the faint, milky ring he had seen encircling the moon. He explained that the color, a pale and almost greasy white, was a specific omen his father had taught him to recognize above all others. It was not a sign of a hard winter or an early frost. It was a prophecy of something else entirely, a force of nature that had a name. He let the words hang in the silent room, his voice dropping to a near whisper as he repeated the phrase his father had used all those years ago. He told them the halo promised a season of house-burying snow. For a long moment, the only sound was the ticking of a clock on the wall. The men stared at him, their expressions unreadable. Then, a sound broke the stillness, sharp and dismissive. It was Jedediah Crawford, laughing. It wasn't a warm or amused laugh. It was a dry, brittle sound, a tool designed to shatter the fragile credibility Jonas had tried to build. The laughter spread like a contagion, and soon the other men were shifting in their seats, their faces relaxing into condescending smiles. The tension in the room evaporated, replaced by an atmosphere of open ridicule. Jonas felt the blood rush to his face, a hot wave of shame and anger that he fought to control. He had offered them a lifeline, and they had mistaken it for a child's ghost story, a piece of foolishness to be brushed aside. Crawford rose slowly from his chair, his height casting a long shadow over the table. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His words were precise, each one a carefully aimed stone. He looked not at Jonas, but at the other council members, as if the boy wasn't even there. He spoke of the importance of facts, of figures written in almanacs and ledgers, the only language of truth he recognized. Then his eyes finally settled on Jonas, and the disdain in them was palpable. He called him a superstitious liar, the words echoing in the small room. He accused Jonas of inventing these wild tales, of using his father's strange folklore as a way to avoid his share of the hard work that remained before winter. He twisted the boy's genuine fear into a narrative of laziness and deceit, painting him as a burden trying to stir up panic. The verdict was immediate and unanimous, delivered not by a vote but by a collective nodding of heads. Crawford's authority was absolute, his dismissal of Jonas's warning a command for them to do the same. They looked at the boy now not with curiosity, but with annoyance. He was a distraction, an unsettling element in their orderly world. The meeting was adjourned without another word spoken to him. Jonas was left standing alone in the center of the room, the scent of their derision hanging in the air. The humiliation was a physical thing, a weight pressing down on his chest that made it difficult to breathe. He had faced their disbelief and found it to be as solid and impenetrable as a wall of granite. He was an outcast, and his truth was an orphan, abandoned in a room full of powerful men who had chosen to be blind. As he walked out of the store and into the fading afternoon light, Jonas understood that the threat had changed. It was no longer just the abstract fury of a coming winter. It was now immediate, personal, and standing right behind him in the form of Jedediah Crawford. He had not just failed to convince them, he had made himself an enemy. Crawford's public denouncement was more than just an insult, it was a brand. He was now the liar, the boy who cried wolf. The animosity he had seen in the council leader's eyes was a clear and present danger, a second storm gathering on a much closer horizon. He knew then that he could not stay. To remain in Elm Creek was to wait for one of two inevitable destructions, the one that would fall from the sky, or the one that would come from the heart of the town itself. The weight of Jedediah Crawford's words settled over Jonas like a second winter. In the days following the council meeting, the town's passive indifference curdled into something colder and more active. The brand of liar clung to him, a label whispered by women as he passed and stared by men, who now saw his quiet observations as a form of insolence. He felt their eyes on him as he worked, a constant prickling scrutiny that searched for any sign of laziness or deceit to confirm Crawford's verdict. The farmers who had once passed him his meals with a weary tolerance now did so with a sharp, dismissive gesture, the plates set down hard on the porch steps. The world of Elm Creek, which had always held him at arm's length, was now actively pushing him away, its collective mind poisoned by a single man's unyielding pride and fear of the unknown. He was no longer just an outsider, he was a threat to their carefully constructed reality. This quiet hostility soon became a campaign, subtly orchestrated by Crawford. The council leader began speaking openly of the boy's attempts to spread panic, twisting Jonas's earnest warnings into a malicious effort to disrupt the final crucial days of the harvest. He framed the boy's knowledge as a dangerous contagion, a primitive superstition that could undo the community's hard-won progress. The narrative took root quickly in the fertile soil of their fear. Other children, emboldened by their parents' scorn, would sometimes throw small stones that landed just short of where he worked in the fields, their taunts of crazy and heathen carried on the wind. Jonas learned to build a wall inside himself, a place where their words could not reach. He retreated further into the world of his father's teachings, finding a strange comfort in the very signs they had taught him to mistrust. for they were the only truth he had left. The inevitable conclusion arrived less than a week later. The council convened again, this time without the pretense of listening to him. He learned of their decision not through a formal announcement, but through the suffocating finality of their actions. The next morning no one came to the barn to assign him his daily chores. The door to the farmhouse remained shut, the windows dark and impassive. When he finally ventured out, the silence that greeted him was absolute. People turned their heads as he walked by, refusing to meet his gaze. It was a shunning, a communal excommunication that was more chilling than any spoken condemnation. He was a ghost in a town that was still living, and he understood with a dreadful certainty that they had passed a sentence. They were not just ignoring his warning, they were erasing the one who delivered it, casting him out to face the very fate they refused to believe in. That night, huddled in the hayloft, a profound and terrifying clarity descended upon him. For hours, raw fear had been a living thing inside his chest, a cold, clawing animal. He saw himself freezing in the coming snows, a forgotten body buried until the spring thaw. But then, another image rose to meet the terror, a memory so vivid it was almost a presence in the dark barn. He saw his father, Samuel, sitting by a fire in the northern hills, pointing to a specific formation of granite boulders. He heard his father's voice, calm and steady, explaining how the earth itself could offer shelter if you knew how to ask. It was one of the last lessons he had ever received, a final piece of wisdom about building a winter refuge, a dugout hidden from the wind and snow. The memory was a spark in the overwhelming darkness. Their expulsion was not a death sentence. It was, he realized, his only chance at life. The decision, once made, transformed him. The fear did not vanish, but it was forged into something harder, a cold, sharp-edged purpose. For the next 2 days, while he waited for his official exile, he existed in a state of intense mental preparation. He ate the scraps left for him, but his mind was elsewhere, miles away in the northern hills. He walked the landscape in his memory, tracing the path along the frozen creek bed, past the stand of skeletal birch trees, to the cluster of ancient rocks his father had called the sleeping giants. He mentally inventoried the tools Samuel had told him were hidden there, wrapped in oilcloth and buried beneath a flat stone. A small axe, a shovelhead, a pickaxe. He rehearsed the steps for digging into the hillside, for bracing the roof with timber, for creating the hidden ventilation shaft his father had named the Earth's Breath. His mind became a workshop, building his survival long before his hands could begin the work. He spent his final night in the barn not sleeping, but preparing his spirit for what was to come. The profound loneliness of his situation was a physical weight, a pressure behind his eyes that threatened to break him. He pulled the smooth river stone from his pocket, its familiar coolness a tether to his past, to his father's strength. He allowed himself one last moment to feel the sting of the town's betrayal, the bitter injustice of their blindness. Then he let it go. Anger was a fire that would consume precious energy. Grief was a luxury he could not afford. He had to become like the stone in his hand, hard, smooth, and enduring. He would not survive to prove them wrong. He would survive because his father had taught him how, and because his own life was a truth more powerful than their collective lie. The meager preparations he could make were done in secret, in the pre-dawn darkness of his final morning. He knew the council would provide him with a pack, a symbolic gesture to absolve themselves of outright murder, but he couldn't trust it to contain anything of real value. From a small wooden box of his father's belongings, he took a whetstone, its surface worn into a gentle curve from years of use. He also secured a small, sharp skinning knife. He found a piece of discarded leather and, using a charred stick from a long-dead fire, sketched a crude map of the route to the rocks, a secret guide he tucked deep inside his worn coat. As he was hiding the map, he heard the farmer stirring inside the house, the sound of a floorboard creaking. Jonas froze, his heart hammering against his ribs, every muscle tensed for discovery. The sound faded, and he was alone again, the silence amplifying the frantic beating of his own heart. Before the sun had fully risen, he stood at the edge of the fields and performed a silent farewell. He looked at the barn, the only home he had known for a year, its weathered wood glowing faintly in the grey light. He looked toward the distant sleeping town, a collection of dark shapes against the horizon, with only a few chimneys beginning to trail smoke into the cold air. There was no sadness in the gaze, no sense of loss for a place that had never truly been his. It was the detached observation of a surveyor taking a final measurement. This was the world that had cast him out. This was the life he was leaving behind. He was memorizing the shape of his own past, fixing it in his mind before turning his back on it forever, a necessary act before he could begin the difficult work of building a future. He did not have to wait long. A single man, one of the junior council members named Elias Thorne, approached him as he stood by the road. Thorne's face was a mask of grim duty, his eyes refusing to meet Jonas's. He carried a small canvas backpack, which he held out without a word. Inside, Jonas could feel the dense weight of 3 loaves of hard bread and a small parcel of dried meat. It was a pittance, a ration for a journey they did not expect him to survive. Thorne finally spoke, his voice low and formal, reciting the council's decree. Jonas Elijah Whitmore was exiled from the community of Elm Creek, forbidden from returning under penalty of the harshest consequence. Jonas simply took the pack, its weight settling uncomfortably on his small shoulders, and turned his face to the north, toward the low, dark line of the hills. The first steps were the hardest, each one a conscious act of severing his connection to the town. He did not look back. He fixed his eyes on the horizon and walked, his pace steady and deliberate. The cold November air was sharp in his lungs, a clean, biting sensation that felt like a purification. With every yard he put between himself and Elm Creek, the weight of their judgment seemed to lessen, replaced by the simple physical reality of his task. He was no longer the liar, the outcast, the superstitious boy. He was a survivor, a hunter, a builder. He was Samuel Whitmore's son, walking toward a destiny his father had prepared for him. The wind picked up, whispering through the bare branches of the trees, and for the first time in a long time, it did not sound like a threat. It sounded like a promise. The northern road was not a road at all, but a suggestion, a pair of ruts carved into the hard earth by the occasional hunter's wagon. For Jonas, it was a lifeline. He kept his pace brisk. A steady, ground-eating stride his father had taught him was more efficient than running. The canvas pack, with its meager rations, felt impossibly heavy, its straps digging into the thin wool of his coat and pressing a dull ache into his shoulders. The cold was a constant companion, a presence that seeped through his worn boots and numbed his fingers. He did not look back, not once. To look back was to acknowledge the world that had rejected him, to give it power over the path that now lay ahead. Elm Creek was a memory, a chapter that had ended abruptly. And the only thing that mattered now was the horizon and the steady rhythm of his own breathing in the sharp, clean air. He walked for hours, the familiar checkerboard of fenced fields and pastures slowly giving way to a wilder landscape. The neat lines of civilization blurred and then vanished, replaced by the dense, tangled chaos of the deep woods. Here, the silence was different. It was not the empty, watchful silence of the town, but a living quiet, filled with the rustle of unseen things in the undergrowth and the low moan of the wind through the skeletal branches of oak and maple. He felt a strange sense of homecoming in this untamed world. It was a place that did not judge, a place that operated on a set of rules he understood. The language of the forest was his father's language, and here, surrounded by the ancient, indifferent trees, he felt less alone than he ever had in the crowded pews of the Elm Creek Church. As the sun began its slow descent, painting the western sky in bruised shades of purple and orange, the reality of his situation settled in with a new and chilling weight. The last of the day's warmth was being leached from the air, and the temperature dropped with an alarming speed. He was a boy, 12 years old, with nothing but a few loaves of bread and the ghost of his father's voice to protect him from the coming night. A tremor of fear, cold and sharp, ran through him. It would be so easy to falter, to sit down beneath a tree and let the encroaching darkness and cold simply have him. The thought was a dangerous comfort, a whisper of surrender that he had to actively fight back, pushing it down with the sheer force of his will to live. He forced himself to stop only long enough to tear off a piece of the hard bread, chewing it mechanically as he continued to walk. The taste was like sawdust in his mouth, but he knew he needed the fuel. He remembered his father showing him how to eat on the move, how to conserve every ounce of energy and momentum on a long journey. These memories were more than just comfort. They were a practical manual for survival, a set of instructions he replayed in his mind with a desperate focus. Each lesson recalled was another tool in his arsenal, another small victory against the overwhelming odds that were stacked against him. He was not just walking. He was performing a ritual of remembrance, keeping his father's wisdom alive with every step he took. When true darkness fell, it was absolute, a thick, starless blanket that swallowed the landscape whole. He was forced to slow his pace, his feet shuffling cautiously over the uneven ground. Then, the clouds parted for a moment, and a spray of icy stars appeared in the blackness above. He located the North Star almost instantly, a familiar, steady point of light in the vast, indifferent cosmos. It was a small thing, but it felt like a miracle. It was proof that his father's teachings were true, that there was an order to the world that existed beyond the fickle judgments of men like Jedediah Crawford. The star was his compass, a silent guide that confirmed he was still moving in the right direction, a fixed point of hope in his swirling world of fear and uncertainty. His focus was shattered by a sudden sharp crack from the woods to his right. He froze mid-stride, his heart leaping into his throat. Every muscle in his body went rigid. It was the sound of a heavy foot snapping a dry twig. He strained his ears, listening to the profound silence that followed, a silence that now felt menacing. Was it a deer or something else? A wolf? Or the most terrifying thought of all, someone from the town who had followed him? He stood perfectly still for what felt like an eternity, his breath held tight in his chest, until the only sound was the frantic, panicked drumming of his own pulse in his ears. The sound did not come again, but the fear it left behind was a cold, living presence that walked beside him in the dark. The physical toll of the journey was becoming immense. A fire had started in his calves, and his shoulders felt as though they were being torn apart by the weight of the pack. He stumbled over an exposed tree root, his tired legs giving way, and fell hard onto the frozen ground. The impact knocked the wind out of him, and a sharp, searing pain shot through his knee. He lay there for a moment, the cold of the earth seeping into him, and the temptation to simply close his eyes was overwhelming. The sheer exhaustion was a physical entity, a heavy blanket that promised a final, dreamless sleep. It took every ounce of his remaining strength to fight against that deadly siren song, to force himself to push up onto his hands and knees. He reached into his pocket, and his fingers closed around the smooth, familiar shape of the river stone. Its coldness was a jolt, a shock to his system that seemed to cut through the fog of his exhaustion. He pressed his thumb into its worn surface, the solid, unyielding feel of it a connection to his father, to a strength greater than his own. He remembered Samuel telling him that even the strongest hunter had to know when to rest, that to push a body past its breaking point was not strength, but foolishness. He understood then that he had to stop. He crawled to the base of a small rock outcropping, a shallow overhang that offered minimal protection from the wind, and allowed himself to collapse into a tight, shivering ball. The stone clutched tightly in his hand. He awoke before dawn, his body a constellation of aches. Every joint was stiff, and a deep, penetrating cold had settled into his bones. The world was a uniform shade of grey, the trees dark silhouettes against a slightly less dark sky. This was the second day, and with it came a new and terrifying challenge. The landscape was now completely alien. The familiar woods of Elm Creek were far behind him, and the terrain ahead was a wild, unreadable expanse. He pulled the piece of worn leather from inside his coat, his fingers fumbling with the cold. The crude map his father had helped him draw years ago was his only guide now, its charred lines a fragile thread of hope in this vast and intimidating wilderness. For hours, he walked in a state of heightened anxiety, his eyes scanning the landscape for any recognizable feature. The forest seemed to repeat itself, every cluster of birch trees and every frozen stream looking exactly like the last. A cold knot of panic began to form in his stomach. Was he lost? Had he taken a wrong turn in the darkness? The thought was paralyzing. He had to force himself to breathe, to push down the rising tide of fear. He had to trust the map. He had to trust his father's lessons. He began to look for the smaller signs Samuel had taught him to see, the specific type of moss that grew only on the north side of the rocks, the subtle changes in the forest floor that indicated higher ground. He focused on these minute details, turning the act of walking into a form of intense concentration. This was not a journey he could complete with his body alone. It required his mind, his memory, his entire being. He was no longer just a boy fleeing a town. He was a reader of the earth, deciphering a language written in stone and bark and water. He followed the curve of a frozen creek, just as the map indicated, his eyes searching for the split oak tree his father had marked as a waypoint. When he finally saw it, its two halves reaching for the sky like skeletal arms, a surge of adrenaline and relief coursed through him. He was on the right path. He was not lost. It was late in the afternoon when he saw them. He crested a small ridge, pushing through a thicket of barren bushes, and the trees fell away to reveal a clearing. There in the distance stood a formation of massive granite boulders, hulking and grey against the bleak winter sky. They looked like giant creatures asleep under the clouds. The sleeping giants. A choked sob escaped his throat, a sound of pure, unadulterated relief. It was real. The place from his father's stories, the destination that had existed only in his memory and on a piece of scorched leather, was real, and it was right in front of him. The sight filled him with a strength he didn't know he still possessed, a final reserve of energy to close the distance. The last few 100 yards were a blur of motion. His aching body screamed in protest, but his mind was fixed on the rocks. He stumbled and scrambled down the ridge, his legs moving on pure instinct. This was more than just a place, it was a promise. It was the physical manifestation of his father's foresight, a legacy of love left for him in the wild heart of the wilderness. He had followed the path, endured the fear and the pain, and he had arrived. The crushing weight of his exile, the loneliness of the journey, all of it seemed to recede as he drew closer to the silent, waiting stones. He had been cast out, but he had found his way to a different kind of home. He finally reached the base of the largest boulder and pressed his palm flat against its rough, cold surface. The stone felt ancient, solid, and real. He had made it. The frantic, desperate flight from Elm Creek was over. He leaned his forehead against the rock, his body trembling with exhaustion and relief, and closed his eyes. The wind howled around him, but for the first time it did not sound like a threat. It was just the wind. He was here. He was safe. But as he took his first deep, shuddering breath, he knew this was not an ending. It was the beginning of a much harder fight, the fight to build a life from the unforgiving materials of the earth, to survive the house-burying snow that he knew was still to come. The sleeping giants had offered up their heart. For 3 relentless weeks, Jonas had worked not with the frantic energy of a boy, but with the focused, methodical pace of a stonemason. He had found his father's hidden tools exactly where Samuel had said they would be, the oilcloth-wrapped steel cold, but perfect in his hands. He had dug into the frozen earth, expanding a shallow overhang into a true sanctuary, a space just large enough to stand in, just long enough to lie down. He braced the low ceiling with timbers cut from deadfall pine, their resinous scent filling the enclosed space. He fit the door, a heavy thing made of scavenged planks, so precisely into its frame that not a whisper of wind could penetrate the seal. He was not just building a shelter, he was resurrecting his father's wisdom, turning memory into a physical reality of wood and stone and earth. The work was brutal, leaving his hands blistered and his back a landscape of deep aches, but with every shovelful of dirt he felt the town of Elm Creek and its cold judgment receding further into the past. The interior of the dugout was a world unto itself, a pocket of warmth and life carved from the dead of winter. A small, efficient fire burned in a stone-lined pit near the entrance, its smoke drawn upwards through the ingenious ventilation shaft his father had called the Earth's breath. The air was thick with the smells of pine smoke, drying herbs, and the rich, savory scent of smoked rabbit meat hanging in strips from the ceiling beams. Along one wall he had stacked firewood almost to the roof, a dense fortress of fuel that promised to hold the winter at bay. On the other side were his provisions, sacks of foraged nuts and edible roots, and the carefully prepared meat from his hunts. It was a space born of foresight and desperation, a testament to a knowledge the world had dismissed. Here, surrounded by the fruits of his labor, Jonas was no longer a ward or an outcast. He was a provider, a master of his own small subterranean kingdom. On the night he drove the final wooden peg into the doorframe, the first snowflakes of the season began to fall. They were not the gentle, drifting flakes of a picturesque winter, but small, hard pellets that hissed as they hit the ground. Jonas stood in the doorway for a moment, watching the world turn white, a profound sense of finality settling over him. He had done it. He had built his ark before the flood. As he was about to close the door and seal himself inside, a movement at the edge of the clearing caught his eye. A single red fox, its coat the color of a dying ember, sat watching him, its head cocked with an unnerving intelligence. It was the very animal his father had always said was a messenger of great change. The fox held his gaze for a long moment, then turned and vanished into the thickening snow, leaving Jonas with a feeling that was equal parts solace and foreboding. He spent the next 2 months in a state of suspended animation, a quiet, solitary existence governed by the needs of the fire and the length of the days. The snow fell and did not stop. The world outside his door was erased, buried under a monolithic blanket of white. The howling of the wind became the only music he knew, a constant, muffled roar that spoke of a fury he could scarcely imagine. He rationed his food with a discipline that belied his age, his movements deliberate and calm. He was not just surviving, he was living out the final, most important lesson his father had ever taught him. That the wilderness could be a cruel and unforgiving enemy, but it could also be a provider, a protector, if you knew how to listen to its language and respect its power. He was an island of warmth in an ocean of lethal cold, a single beating heart buried alive, but safe within the earth. It was in the deepest cold of January, weeks after the storm had finally broken, that the sound came. It was not the familiar moan of the wind or the groan of a snow-laden branch. It was something else, a rhythmic, scraping noise, followed by a muffled thud against his door. He froze, a piece of smoked meat halfway to his mouth. His heart began a frantic, heavy beat against his ribs. It was impossible. No animal would be moving in this cold. No hunter would be this far into the hills. The sound came again, more insistent this time, accompanied by a faint, desperate cry that was almost swallowed by the wind. It was a human voice. The realization sent a jolt of ice through his veins, a fear colder than any winter storm. He was no longer alone. He moved silently to the door, pressing his ear against the rough wood. He could hear them now, a shuffling of many feet, the low murmur of exhausted voices. They were right outside, their presence a violation of the perfect solitude he had so painstakingly built. He knew with a certainty that left no room for doubt who they were. It could only be the people of Elm Creek. The thought was a maelstrom of conflicting emotions, a flicker of vindictive triumph, a wave of raw fear, and a deep, weary sense of inevitability. They had not come looking for a savior. They had come looking for a grave, a final, frozen confirmation that their judgment had been correct. He stood there for a long time, his hand hovering over the thick wooden latch, the fate of the 27 souls on the other side of the door resting in his small, chapped palm. He did not know what he would see on their faces. Scorn, desperation, a new kind of hatred born from the realization that he had been right. He took a slow, steadying breath, the warm, smoky air of his shelter, a stark contrast to the deathly cold he was about to invite inside. He thought of his father, of the red fox, of the smooth river stones still in his pocket. He was not acting out of mercy, nor out of a desire for revenge. He was acting out of a simple, profound truth that had been drilled into him since birth. You did not let a living thing freeze if you had a fire to share. It was a law older and more fundamental than any council decree or biblical verse. It was the law of the earth, and it was the only law he had ever truly followed. With a final, decisive movement, he lifted the latch. The small wooden door, barely visible against the snow-drifted hillside, creaked open, spilling a rectangle of impossible golden light onto the frozen ground. The biting January air rushed in, a physical shock that made him flinch. For the 27 souls huddled outside, it was a sight that defied all logic. They had come expecting to find a mound of ice marking the final resting place of the boy they had cast out. Instead, They found him alive. He stood in the doorway, framed by the warmth of a steady fire, the scent of smoked meat and pine smoke clinging to him like a second skin. He was not the starved, frozen corpse they had imagined, but a silent, steady presence. His eyes, accustomed to the dim light of the dugout, adjusted to the harsh glare of the snow. He saw them clearly then, a ragged collection of ghosts, their faces hollowed out by hunger and frostbite, their eyes wide with a mixture of shock and utter disbelief. At the very front of the group, his face a mask of gaunt horror, stood Jedediah Crawford. The man's beard was caked with ice, and his proud, rigid posture had collapsed into the desperate stoop of a beggar. His eyes met Jonas's, and in that gaze there was no triumph, no anger, only a profound and unsettling stillness that seemed to magnify the howling of the wind and the depth of their own shame. The circle was now complete. The boy they had banished for speaking a prophecy was now the sole gatekeeper of their survival. The 6 weeks that followed were a lifetime, lived in a space no bigger than a homesteader's wagon. The 27 survivors from Elm Creek existed in the dugout, not as people, but as ghosts, their bodies huddled together for warmth, while their spirits seemed to hover somewhere outside, lost in the howling white fury of the world. They moved with a listless, shuffling economy, their gazes fixed on the fire or the rough stone walls, their silence a heavy, suffocating blanket of shame. Jedediah Crawford was the most silent of all, a statue of a man carved from regret, who spent his days staring into the flames as if searching for an answer that would never come. Jonas moved among them, a silent, efficient engine of their survival. He rationed the food, tended the fire, and melted snow for water, his face a mask of detached focus. He felt no triumph, no anger, only the profound, weary weight of responsibility. He was a keeper, and they were his flock, and the history between them had been burned away by the all-consuming cold. This fragile, unspoken truce was governed by the simple, brutal necessities of life and death. Jonas would venture out into the blinding, frozen landscape to check his snares, returning with a few precious rabbits that he would prepare with a methodical precision that both awed and shamed them. They watched him work, this boy they had cast out, and saw in his small, chapped hands a competence that dwarfed their own collective experience. They saw the wisdom they had called superstition manifest as the warmth that kept their children from freezing, as the food that quieted the ache in their bellies. The memory of their scorn, of Crawford's dismissive laughter in the council room, was a palpable presence in the shelter, a 30th soul whose silent accusations were more damning than any words Jonas could have spoken. They were living inside the very truth they had denied, and its walls were closing in on them. The crisis arrived in the 4th week, carried on the fevered breath of a small child. It was Sarah Miller, the blacksmith's youngest daughter, who began to cough, a dry, rasping sound that echoed the one Jonas remembered from his own father's final days. The sound cut through his carefully constructed emotional detachment, a shard of memory so sharp it made him flinch. He watched as the girl's mother held her, her face a mask of rising panic that was terrifyingly familiar. He immediately went to his small store of medicinal herbs, the ones his father had taught him to gather and dry, and prepared a tea from willow bark and elderflower. He administered it with a steady hand, but as he felt the heat radiating from the child's small body, he knew this was the same fire that had consumed his father, and the remedies he possessed were but a handful of water against a raging inferno. He used the last of the herbs 2 days later, the child's condition worsening with every passing hour. The small dugout was filled with the sound of her labored breathing and her mother's muffled sobs. The people of Elm Creek looked to Jonas, their eyes pleading, their faces etched with a desperate new kind of hope that he was some sort of miracle worker, a boy shaman who could command the forces of nature. The weight of their expectation was crushing. He was not a miracle worker. He was just a boy, and he was failing. The helplessness he felt was a cold, familiar poison, the same impotence he had felt watching his own father fade away. As he stared at the empty herb pouch, a fragment of a memory surfaced, a story Samuel had told him by a fire long ago, about a hunter's last resort, a secret cache hidden for a day of absolute desperation. He had never given the story much thought, dismissing it as one of his father's more fanciful tales. But now, with the child's life hanging in the balance, the memory became a lifeline. His father had spoken of the sleeping giants, saying that the oldest and largest of them held a secret in its heart. Forgetting the silent audience behind him, Jonas began to move with a new urgency, running his hands over the cold, rough walls of the dugout, searching for something he wasn't sure even existed. He pressed and tapped, listening for a hollow sound, feeling for any inconsistency in the ancient stone. The others watched him, their confusion plain, as he worked his way to the back of the shelter, to the small alcove where he slept. There, tucked away behind his bedroll, was a section of rock that seemed subtly different from the rest. He worked his fingers into a thin crack and pulled. At first it didn't move, but he braced himself and pulled again, his muscles straining. With a low, grinding sound, a large, flat stone came loose, revealing a dark, square cavity within the larger boulder. It was not a natural formation. It had been carved. A cold draught, smelling of deep earth and something else, something clean and medicinal, flowed out of the opening. His heart hammered against his ribs. It was real. His father's story was real. Reaching into the darkness, his fingers brushed against the cold, smooth surface of a metal box. He drew it out into the firelight. It was a simple tin box, heavy for its size and sealed with a thick layer of hardened wax. It was not part of the hunter's camp. This was something else. This was a message. With trembling fingers, he used his knife to break the seal and pry open the lid. The sight within stole his breath. The first thing he saw was a large, tightly wrapped bundle of oilcloth. As he unwrapped it, a powerful, familiar scent filled the small space. The sharp, clean aroma of sage, willow bark, and yarrow. It was a massive store of the very herbs he had just run out of, enough to last through 10 such illnesses. It was an impossible, miraculous provision, a direct answer to a need his father could not possibly have known he would have. It was a gesture of care so specific, so prescient, that it felt like a form of magic, a love that defied the very boundaries of time and death. Beneath the herbs there was more. He found a small, soft leather pouch. Inside, his fingers closed around 2 objects. The first was a brand new whetstone, its surface perfectly flat and smooth, a replacement for the one he had worn down through years of use. The second was a small wooden bird, carved with incredible detail from a piece of dark walnut. It was a hawk, its wings outstretched, its eyes sharp and focused. It was his father's personal totem, the one he had always kept in his pocket, a symbol of his ability to see things from a great height, to understand the world in its entirety. To find it here was to find a piece of his father's very soul, left behind for him to hold on to. At the very bottom of the box, lying flat against the cold tin, was a single piece of folded paper, yellowed with age, but perfectly preserved. He picked it up, his hands shaking so much he could barely hold it steady. He unfolded it carefully. On the page was his father's handwriting, a rough, untutored script he recognized instantly. He could not read most of the words, his own literacy being almost non-existent, but he could make out his own name, Jonas and his father's, Samuel. It was a letter, a final word he never knew existed. The weight of it, the sheer impossible reality of it, was overwhelming. This was the true secret his father had left for him, buried in the heart of the stone. He looked up from the letter, his eyes scanning the faces of the silent townspeople. He needed a voice. His gaze settled on Mrs. Winona Black Deer, the old Lakota woman who had occasionally shown him small kindnesses, a woman who understood a world beyond the written words in almanacs. He walked to her and held out the paper, his throat too tight to speak. She took it, her old eyes understanding the sanctity of the moment. She moved closer to the fire, the other survivors leaning in, their own grief and shame momentarily forgotten in the face of this sacred revelation. Her voice, when she began to read, was a low, soft whisper that seemed to absorb all other sound in the shelter. The letter was not long, its message simple and direct. It was not a farewell, but a guide. Samuel wrote that he had prepared this place not just as a hunting camp, but as a refuge, a final sanctuary for his son, should the world prove too harsh. He spoke of the town and its blindness, not with anger, but with a sad understanding. They read books, Mrs. Blackdeer read, her voice gentle. "But they have forgotten how to read the world. You have not." The words were a validation of everything Jonas was, a shield against every insult he had ever endured. It was proof that his way of seeing was not a curse, but a sacred inheritance passed from father to son. Then came the final lines, the words that would forever alter the landscape of Jonas's soul. "I do not know what trials you will face," his father had written, "but you will not face them alone. I leave you the earth's heart in your pocket, and this safe place to keep your own. Live, my son. See the world for me." In that moment, the entire narrative of Jonas's life shifted on its axis. He was not an orphan, abandoned to the cold charity of strangers. He was not an outcast who had gotten lucky. He was the sole heir to a kingdom of love, a recipient of a legacy of foresight so profound it felt like a prophecy fulfilled. His father had seen it all, the town's rejection, the coming winter, his son's solitude, and he had built an answer made of stone and earth. A single tear, hot and cleansing, escaped his eye and traced a clean path through the grime on his cheek. It was not a tear of sadness, but of a gratitude so immense it was painful. The dugout was not a shelter he had built. It was a home his father had left for him. His survival was not a feat of his own strength. It was the final, powerful act of a father's love, a love that had reached across the veil of death to provide warmth in the coldest of winters. He had never been alone, not for a single moment. His father had been with him in the rustle of the leaves, in the flight of the geese, and here in the very stones that now gave him and his former tormentors life. He took the small wooden hawk from the box and closed his fist around it, the sharp edges of its wings pressing into his palm. He looked at the sick child, her breathing still shallow and labored, and he felt a new strength flow through him, a purpose that was clear and bright and unshakable. He was not just the boy who had survived. He was Samuel Whitmore's son, and he had a duty to fulfill. He had been given this knowledge, this sanctuary, not for vengeance but for guardianship. He turned from the fire, his face calm and resolute, and began to prepare the medicine. His movements no longer just the rote actions of a survivor, but the sacred, deliberate motions of a healer, continuing the work his father had begun. When the great thaw finally came in late February, it was as if the world was being born anew. The 27 survivors of Elm Creek emerged from the dugout, blinking in the pale sunlight, into a landscape scoured clean by the winter's fury. Their town was a ruin, their old certainties buried under feet of melted snow. As they prepared for the wretched journey home, Jedediah Crawford cleared his throat, his face gaunt, and began to stammer the opening words of a public apology. But Jonas did not wait to hear it. He shouldered his small pack, the tin box and the wooden hawk safely inside, and turned his back on them, walking away toward the woods. His actions were not born of malice or unforgiveness, but of a simple, profound understanding that his path was no longer intertwined with theirs. Their debts were to their own consciences, not to him. He had not gone 100 yards when a voice called his name. It was not Crawford, but Mrs. Winona Blackdeer. She stood waiting for him at the edge of the trees, her face serene. She did not offer him thanks or pity. She offered him something far more valuable. She offered him a home. She looked at him and saw not the town's unlikely savior, but the son of Samuel Whitmore, a boy who carried the weight of an ancient knowledge and who deserved, for the first time in his life, to have a place where he could simply be a boy. Jonas stopped, and for the first time since his father's death, he accepted a hand that was offered to him. He went with her, leaving the ghosts of Elm Creek to reckon with their own salvation. In the quiet warmth of Winona's home, a new chapter of his life began. She taught him to read and write, to translate the language of the wind and the stars into the black ink of the written word. He spent hours at her kitchen table, painstakingly recording his father's lessons, his hand cramping as he gave permanence to the knowledge that had once been dismissed as folklore. He was bridging the two worlds that had defined his life, honoring his father's legacy not by keeping it secret, but by ensuring it could be shared, that its wisdom would never again be lost to the arrogance of men who only trusted what they could hold in their hands. Jonas Whitmore grew into a man defined not by the bitterness of his past, but by the quiet purpose of his future. He never returned to Elm Creek, But his story became the town's founding myth, a cautionary tale whispered to every new generation. He became a teacher, though he never stood in a classroom, training farmers and travelers across the territory to read the signs of the natural world. He shared his father's wisdom freely, preventing countless hardships and saving untold lives with his uncanny ability to forecast the weather. His life became a long, quiet act of service, a living testament to the truth that the deepest wisdom often comes from the places we are taught to despise. Decades later, after a long and peaceful life, Jonas passed away at the age of 81. The town of Elm Creek, now a prosperous community built on a foundation of humility its founders had sorely lacked, knew it owed him a debt that could never be repaid. They commissioned a statue to be placed in the center of the town square, a permanent reminder of their history, of their failing, and of the boy who had offered grace when they deserved judgment. It was a gesture of profound and lasting repentance, an acknowledgement of the truth they had once tried so desperately to silence. The statue they erected was not of the revered old meteorologist, the wise man known throughout the state. It was the bronze figure of a 12-year-old boy, small and solitary, his coat too thin for the winter. His face is turned not towards the people in the square below him, but upward, toward the northern sky. His gaze fixed on the horizon as if watching for a coming storm. His right hand is tucked deep into his pocket, and anyone who knew his story knew what it was clutching, a small, smooth river stone, the heart of the earth. He stands there still, a silent guardian, forever watching, forever warning, a boy who listened to the world and saved the people who refused to hear its voice.